And so one of the questions is, do you want to have a society based upon a meritocracy, or do you want to have a new class of embedded super wealth? And my own feeling is that if you look at American politics, the temptation always is to go to the extreme, that is death to all death taxes instead of reform the estate tax. And that's the weakness of the Republican Party in a thumbnail. The weakness of the Democratic Party is that a candidate once elected might say, let's take a social program and let's pretend it's federal assistance to unwed mothers. And so a good liberal might say, let's increase it 20%. Someone else might come along and say, I'm a better liberal, let's increase it 30%. And then someone else might say, I'm a really, truly good liberal, let's increase it 100%. And there becomes a very difficult time of constraining government because virtually all federal programs have a positive effect for somebody, and there's a temptation to increase everything and then one lose sight of the whole, and the whole can be more important than the sum of its parts. Anyway, this brings me to what I call Psychology 101. In American politics, there's a new trend towards making issues defined as moral. And the obvious one relates to the social issue of free or pro-choice versus pro-life. Well, if one believes in pro-life and says it's a moral issue, that implies that someone on the pro-choice side is immoral. And there's virtually no grounds of compromise. And that makes a very awkward political setting, because if a pro-life advocate thinks his position is moral and the other is immoral, it's pretty hard to respect the other side. Likewise, if you take democratic morality, if one says that it's only moral to increase some sort of social program, whether it be health care for infants, whether it be a program for unwed mothers, and someone objects that it's too large an increase or that there should be no such program, is that person immoral? And so you have this new sense that it's morality versus immorality, and both parties are wedded to it, and that makes, in a legislative session or environment, and I call this Sociology 101, it's very difficult to reach agreement, both in terms of the issues at stake and the type of people that get to the extremes in politics. So if you visualize the most liberal Democrat, the most conservative Republican in today's circumstance, they're not of a type of background that respects or get along well with the others, and since the glue of lawmaking is respect and chemistry of individuals, it makes Congress operate in awfully difficult ways. This brings me to my next course I call Physics 101. Any of you that have ever studied physics know that there was a chap named Sir Isaac Newton, and Newton once held that there were 3 laws of nature. And the third law was, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, or in shorthand, action equals reaction. Well, one day in the mid-90s, I was sitting in the House floor, and it dawned on me that I had uncovered the 4th Newtonian law. And I discovered it as a pun. We had a Speaker of the House named Newt, and so I call this a Newtonian law. And this law is that in social physics, as contrasted with natural physics, quite frequently reaction is greater than action. So for instance, if I'm to call a student in this audience a bum, he's likely to respond something a little bit tougher to me. And so in social affairs, whether they be personal, whether they be in a legislative environment, and intriguingly now as we look at the world shrinking in international relations, what happens if a leader calls another society evil? Does that society say, oh, you're right, I'll change my ways, or does it sharpen its edges? And we have to recognize that the schoolyard mantra that all our mothers taught us about sticks and stones will break bones, but names will never hurt, sometimes doesn't apply. Sometimes names can be surprisingly more hurtful than a stick or a stone. And this is something in all of life. Now let me now turn to a course I call Moral Philosophy 101. Everybody's heard of the circumstance called the 7 deadly sins. And one thinks about reading about them. We don't know the exact origin, but I want to talk for a second about 2. One I call pride. One is called pride, and the other greed. Pride I consider to be the sin that's politics is disproportionately laden with. And greed, you might say, applies to the business world, but the interesting thing about greed is it's rather practical, at least in a society that has good law and relatively good values. For example, if I'm a salesman of this cup and I say out of greed, I want to sell it to you for $20, that might seem like a really good idea, except no one in this audience is willing to pay $20 for it if someone down the street will sell it for 50 cents. And so greed is constrained by the practicality of competition. Or if I'm a bookstore owner and I read a book I really like and I inventory 6 of it, and then I read one I don't like and I inventory 1, if the public comes in and starts to buy the one I don't like, I don't, out of pride, re-inventory the one I like. I re-inventory the one the public wants. It's a very practical set of judgments. In politics, on the other hand, not infrequently, people take stands, and these positions have consequences, and if they don't work, instead of changing, they sometimes double. And that's a really bizarre circumstance. When I was your age, back a couple centuries back, we had a war called Vietnam. And it's interesting that in the buildup of that war, particularly under President Johnson, a whole series of decisions were made that were described as quite modest. That is, 50,000 troops were followed by 10 or 20,000 more by another 20, and each decision was rather modest, but the sum of the decisions was rather radical. And it was as if 50,000 didn't work, let's try 70. 70 didn't work, let's try 100. Pretty soon we got up to 500,000 at a given moment in time. And it was as if there was a domino theory of decision making that took hold. And a politician, and there are evidence in the tapes and whatever that currently exists, that LBJ had begun to have doubts about the war, but he couldn't change gears because it was too much pride at stake of the individual political figure. Which brings me to Moral Philosophy 102, and it's my view that the only thing more corrupting than aspiring to power is fear of losing it. And decisions get made in very awkward ways for societies when that becomes the case. And so you take Richard Nixon, and the great symbolic decision to me, other than all of the illegality that everybody knows tied up with Watergate, but the real philosophical decision that characterized politics at the extreme, to me, was Richard Nixon seeing inflation coming along, and that inflation was something that the American people didn't want, that he put on wage and price controls, even though, as he said to everybody around him, he knew they wouldn't work, and he knew they were philosophically wrong, and he knew that they would exacerbate economic conditions in the country. But he felt it was a way of taking leadership of the economic issue, as wrong as it was, in order to maintain power. And to me, that's a very symbolic thing in public life, and something that would never happen in the private sector. This brings me to a course I call Economics 101. Protectionism is to economics what interventionism is to politics, and they're the flip side of the what might be described as a unilateralist coin. And I would urge everybody, as you assess candidates today, think through what would happen if America started to lead the world in a protectionist dimension. And I raise this a little bit because I think the Republican Party has probably made some interventionist decisions that the country rues. But the Democratic Party weakness is a clear movement towards protectionism today, and people should watch this with a great deal of care.